Scary stories/ghost stories from your hospital or work. I'm an EMT and eat this stuff up. I'm not necessarily religious, on the fence about it, but I've experienced some stuff I cannot explain. I can recall one fairly well. I was in the basement of the hospital grabbing a new gurney as ours was ripped apart from a violent patient. It was 3 a.m., PICU was on the 3rd floor and it was locked down for the night, no visitors in the hospital. The basement storage unit was packed with stuff, so when I felt my shirt get pulled on I assumed it got caught on an object. Then it happened again, only this time I heard a little girl's voice, crystal clear, say, "I'm lost." My heart was pounding, I felt all the hairs on my body stand up, and I called my partner down to help with the gurney. I've talked to nurses, CNAs, and even some physicians who have had weird experiences, especially in the ICU and hospice side. I've worked in healthcare for over 20 years now and I have a couple from working in nursing homes of seeing the figure in black shooting across the hall and then in the next 24 hours a resident will die and then in less than a week another one will pass as well. But my favorite story is this. I worked at a very small hospital, maybe 30 beds. It has been around for many years. In the basement is of course the old morgue and there is one elevator that goes from the basement to the main floor outside the nurses' station. This elevator would come up in the middle of the night randomly and the doors would open and all the staff would get up to go find the patient who just passed away. One night my co-workers and I were sitting at the nurses' station and down the short hall to our right we hear this TV come on and the volume is up as loud as it can go. One of my CWs and I walked down said hall to find the TV to turn it down. There is one room down that hall that maintenance has the door closed and do not enter signs on the door. After looking in all the open rooms there is no other room but the closed one to look in, we open the door, there is nothing in this room except the TV. I walked in, turned the TV and said, "Stop that, there is a sick baby next door who needs to sleep. So please be quiet." I walked out and closed the door with no further incidents with the TV. Had a coworker, a CNA named Ruthie. Seemed like we had the most activity. When Ruthie was on shift, she was accustomed to it and seemed to know what to do. Most of the time it would be a call light that would keep coming on in an empty room. After the 3rd time or so, Ruthie would go to the room and ask what they needed, pause for a moment for a response. She never heard a response, and she would then come back to the nurse's station and the phantom calls would stop. This is pretty much identical to when I was working at a nursing home after one of our residents passed. We figured out who it was because it seemed to stop for a bit when a certain CNA answered. He had a little crush on her, always jokingly called her Pokey, short for Pocahontas. We picked a night the staff he was close with came, said bye to him, and told him he needed to move on. No further incidents after that. Had something similar happen when I was working in a nursing home. During night shift we were supposed to set the tables for the next day. So while I walked into a room to set the table there, as I walked past the TV, it turns on its own, which made me jump up. I figured I'd set the table and turn it off. As I'm walking back after I'm done I mention something aloud like, "Thanks, but I'm done and I'm leaving," after which the TV just turns itself off. Still freaks me out thinking about it. That aside I've had plenty of instances with weird sounds, doors opening/closing on their own, patients seeing other people or shadows in their rooms. Like this one time I had a pre-terminal patient laying awake in her bed at night. When I went up to her to ask if she wasn't tired she mentioned she couldn't go to sleep while having guests and apparently she saw all kind of people standing around her bed. This isn't scary, but it haunts me more than anything. I had a young mother come into labor and delivery for a scheduled C/S for triplets at 33 weeks. As a PGY2, I was doing her HNP and ultrasound for fetal position. She was super squirrely and nervous, so I asked her if there was anything I could do to help allay her concerns. She told me they had warned her of all these terrible things that would happen to her with a multiple pregnancy and none had. Heck, She'd been mall walking yesterday, and the babies were all projected to be over 4 pounds, hence the C/S now. Then she said, "I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop." I tried to reassure her that everything looked great. Her C/S did go well, and all 3 babies were big. I rounded on her that next morning and went off service. I even told her that, she hadn't anything to worry about. She died the next day from acute cardiac decomposition in a helicopter on the way to another hospital trying to get a heart transplant. She, apparently, had been developing dilated cardiomyopathy, and the uterus pressing on her SVC was keeping her compensated. The delivery killed her. She knew. Somehow, she just knew. That bothers me more than any ghosts. I started my nursing career at a small and very old urban hospital. So small that they were closing it all up. I worked in labor and delivery and we were the only unit left. There were a bunch of clinics and offices but they weren't open nights/weekends. One night, we had to do a reasonably emergent C/S on a patient who was from out of town. Meaning she didn't have a support person with her. As far as I remember, the C/S was going well, I was scrubbed in. We were in the middle of it when the patient stopped responding to the anesthetist. Her vitals were all normal but she just stopped talking to her, stopped responding to questions. I could hear the anesthetist ask her, "Hey, are you okay?" a few times. After a few minutes, the patient started responding again and all was well. I had her in recovery room, just me and her, the babies were in the NICU, and things were pretty straightforward. But I did mention to her about the strange episode during the C/S. She said, "I saw my grandmother in the OR. I was so scared and I asked her to hold my hand but she told me that she couldn't touch me." That sure was something for a 23 years old to hear at 0300 in a room far away from any of my coworkers in a very, very old and empty hospital. On one of my old floors I worked on we always had weird occurrences happen at night. It was a neuro step-down unit. This unit had glass walls so you could chart and monitor your patient. We had a patient who had a severe stroke and was non-verbal. Feeding tube, restrained, total care, etc. They rarely had family visit too. In the middle of the night, their call light went off. When I answered it, a woman said, "He is really hurting. He needs his pain medicine." So I walk into the room to check on him. The room is dark, nobody is in there, and the patient is sleeping. I tell his nurse what happened and I go and sit back down at the CN desk. The call light goes off again. It is his room. Same voice, "Please, he is really hurting." I get up and walk back to the room. Same story. I tell his nurse and she gives him pain medicine through his peg and we reposition him in bed. The call light does not go off again. It was really eerie. Strange things happened on that floor. It was my second night with this point in his late 80s. He was terminally ill and was leaving for home hospice. In the middle of the night, I go to do vitals and he's talking out loud in his sleep and fidgeting. Hadn't done it the night before. I wake him up and ask what he was dreaming. Tells me he was dreaming about being with his friends when he was younger, such as going to the bar and partying. Said it was some of his favorite times in his life. I thought that must have had a great dream and left when I finished care. A couple hours later, I had left with a coworker to pick up a PT. When I returned, all of my coworkers are freaking out, even our senior nurses. My point was on portable video because he could be forgetful at times. On the camera, they had witnessed multiple orbs shooting through the room that had looked similar to shooting stars. We get that from time to time, but they said that there were a crazy amount to where the room looked like it was glowing. Some coworkers even went in to check. When they did, the video person said they'd disappear then return when staff left. By the time I returned, the orbs had just stopped. About 15 to 30 minutes later, my point wakes up and decides to get up from the bed. I go in there and thought it was weird for him because he didn't really do that the night prior. I ask him where he's going. He points to an area behind me and says that his friends are here and want to play cards with him. My coworker who was with me paled. I just said that they should play cards when it was a little later and tucked him into bed. I thought that this whole situation was pretty wholesome. My coworkers thought I was nuts, haha. I was like his friends just wanted to stop by and say hi. I used to work on a floor back in the day. Had a patient who was being discharged the next morning, only on PRN pain meds and hadn't had anything mind-altering all day. I go in his room at 3 a.m. and ask him why he can't sleep. He says, "I'm not hurting or anything. And don't get me wrong, I love kids, but why are y'all letting children run around the unit so late?" I asked what he was talking about. He said, "The kids in the dinosaur and cowboy costumes." I said I hadn't seen them, but I'll let the other staff know to send these kids back to their parents, thinking to myself, who the hell let them in here this late in the first place? I head back to the nurse's station and tell the charge, who has worked there for years. I tell him, "Hey, the dude in room XY said he can't sleep cause some kids keep coming in his room." He looks at me and says, less alarmed than you'd expect, "Oh, the kids in the dinosaur and cowboy costumes?" I asked a couple other more veteran staff and they all had stories of patients telling them the same thing. If they were all messing with me, then half the unit and my patient were phenomenal liars. I have 3. The first is our unit was moved to the old pediatric floor for a renovation. It was like 3 a.m. and the call bell goes off. This point is furious because the point next door has been banging on the walls. We could hear the banging, we apologize, tell them we will go talk to them. Walk into the room next door, the banging stops and that point is sound asleep. Second story, had a patient for a couple months. I do oncology so our patients get sick very fast. He was on comfort care and passed alone. Take him to the morgue, they clean the room, new patient gets in there. Poor lady calls in the middle of the night that there is a strange man sitting in her room. We go and she is like, "I swear he was just here." She describes him, yep, exactly like the former patient. Last one, again another point that we took care of for a few months, a very sad situation. The room is right next to the nurse's station. He had been a very confused active point in a low bed, so constantly setting off alarms. He passes, the room gets cleaned and placed on hold for a new admit. His call bell went off all night long. Finally one of the nurses went in and yelled at him that it was time to quiet down and let us get work done. The call bell didn't go off again. At my old hospital we had Susie. We never were a unit working with children, but everyone who encountered her claimed her to be about 8 years old. We usually only saw a shadowy figure or heard her running over the unit's floor at night. Sometimes she messed with the lights, call lights, computers, or our old paper charts. She didn't seem malevolent and a stern, "Not now Susie, I'm busy," usually kept her in line. She did not like swearing though. One of our newer doctors once made the mistake to tell her to fuck off. After that, bad luck seemed to follow him whenever he stepped on the unit. Misplacing his coffee mug, just to show up later exactly where he had put it down before, but now ice cold. Charts disappearing. Lights turning off in the middle of him placing in 4, which prompted me to call her out and her turning the light back on. His chair going down to the lowest setting every time he sat down, even if we switched chairs. The chair would work perfectly fine for anyone but him. We had him apologize to her and it all stopped, or at least he wasn't that specifically targeted anymore. I kinda miss her. Used to work in a rehab hospital that's been around since the U.S. outbreak of polio, 1910s. The building my unit was on was one of the original buildings. Our unit was constantly experiencing maintenance problems, pipes bursting within the walls, electrical wiring shortages, air conditioning breaking, etc. We all contributed it to the hospital, just repeatedly using band-aid solutions to cut costs. But then we had this room on the floor. While the rest of the unit would be uncomfortably hot, from the broken AC, this room would be chilly. Randomly the toilet in the room would flush. It wasn't sensor activated, just a handle, as well as the automatic paper towel dispenser. The scariest of all though, was when a patient, OX4 with only anticoagulant and hypertensive meds, complained about a woman coming into his room at night while he was sleeping, and just standing there at the foot of his bed before leaving. He legitimately asked to speak to a manager the next day to complain about this unknown staff member interrupting his sleep. He said he couldn't describe what she looked like because it was too dark, only that she had long hair that she wore down. Still creeps me out to this day, and I don't even work there anymore. Haven't had any as a nurse, but when I was a night shift CNA in a locked residential behavioral unit, really old building, I had a few. One, had a resident who was presumably ANOX0, nonverbal, blank stare. Took care of her for about 2 years and never heard her talk once. She was fairly young, 50s and ambulatory, but only if you led her around. One night, I was stalking the room and it was pretty dark. I had thought that she was sleeping. My back was turned, and from the bed, I heard a really low-toned voice say, "He's here for me." I startled and turned around quick to see her sitting up and looking directly at me, pointing to the opposite corner of the room. I was inwardly freaking out, and I just nodded and left. Came back the next night and she had died. 2. Resident who was there for wandering behaviors due to dementia was a huge favorite among staff since he was so sweet. He called me Mija, and had a very distinct voice. Unfortunately, likely had COVID at the very beginning of the pandemic before they had the antigen tests available. Was placed on isolation in a single private room on the unit. Supposedly recovered, but developed pneumonia a few weeks later and passed away. I did the post-mortem care. A few days later, administration decided that the locked unit staff were to remain separate from the rest of the building due to COVID and converted the private room into the staff break room. It was a plastic table and a microwave. Anyway, I'm sitting there eating dinner at 2 a.m., when the hair on my arm stands up. I get up from the table and poke my head out into the hall and see no one, and very clearly over my left shoulder, I hear, "Mija." Gave me chills. Can't say whether it was my head or not, but it freaked me out. 3. Had a resident who self-ambulated to the bathroom at night pretty frequently, with a walker and O2. We would listen and check on him when he was done. Another CNA and I were chatting and talking in the hall around midnight when we heard him get up and go into the bathroom, toilet flush, bedroom light turned on. She stops talking and turns white. The resident had died several days prior, and both of us realized at the same time. No one was in the room, but the light was on, and the bathroom door opened. Bonus points, frequently saw orbs on the camera feeds in the nurse's station, and another CNA claimed that one time all of the unit TVs switched onto the Hallmark channel really loudly and at the same time in the middle of the night. I don't know. That was a weird place. Also not a nurse, but, when my mom was in hospice I stayed overnight the few nights she was there. She wasn't overly communicative or aware at this point, but she kept looking at the upper corner of her suite and would occasionally wave her arm in that direction. I woke in the middle of the night once while I was there. I had dreamt about the people who were in that corner of her suite. I had my dad come and keep me company for the remainder of the night. The next day my aunt came to the hospice house and made me leave for a lunch. When we returned my mom's nurse stated that if there was anything I needed to say that was the time as my mom was breathing her last breaths. Later on I was going through photos at home to prepare for my mom's funeral and came across a photo of the people in the corner from my dream. My maternal, deceased, grandmother, a great-aunt and my great-grandmother, per another aunt who was going through the photos with me. And now everyone in my family believes I have a gift. I have no way to corroborate what I saw. I could have been completely out of my mind with grief. But it's a very real memory and a kind of special last moment where I was connected with my mom. I worked at a very nice nursing home for a while as a med tech/CNA while I was in school. I worked on the memory care unit. Genuinely well cared for, happy residents, clean facilities, the whole 9 yards. One of the residents, Mr. B, had been there since opening day and he was very particular and liked things his way. He had his seat in the dining room, he got exactly 3 scoops of strawberry ice cream after dinner, he sat in his chair by his window until exactly 11:30, just a grumpy lil cutie pie. Well, he inevitably died and a new resident had moved in less than a week later with her own things, but her bed and armchair were in the same place as Mr. B's. Her first night I had done a round and was doing whatever dumb shit I did at night after residents were in bed, washing compression hose or something, and the new resident comes down the hall and said, "There's a man in my room telling me to get out." We had a man who would sometimes wander, so I assumed it was him and went with her to her room to take him back to bed. Her room was empty. Assuming it was still him, I tucked her back in and went to find him. No one was up, and the wanderer was asleep in bed. Oh well, maybe she dreamed it. I went back to the desk and she came up again, maybe 20 minutes later, saying, "He said to get out, that I'm in his room." I walked her back again, nothing. She points to her armchair and is like, "He said to move my chair and put his back and to get out of his room," at which point my brain put 2 and 2 together. I ended up letting her sit in the nurse's station with me until third shift showed up. The third shift CNA got there, and started complaining about the new resident being up. I explained what happened and she rolled her eyes and said, "Come on," and stormed off down the hallway muttering about my incompetence under her breath. She marched into the new resident's room and said, "Mr. B, you are dead. This is not your room anymore, go on and let this poor woman sleep." The resident went to bed, I went home, and after that night there were no more complaints of nighttime visitors from that resident. I felt kind of bad, but I didn't know how to exorcise ghosts, they didn't cover that in the med tech class. Make sure to like, subscribe and comment for more videos like this.